Thanks very much, and thanks to TASC for organising this. I've just been to come back from Tokyo with the IMF meetings there, where austerity and particularly fiscal multipliers caused absolute sensation there. But although most of the finance ministers actually, in our initial press briefings, didn't actually understand what they were, particularly Luis Guindos, the Spanish finance minister, who is of the contractionary expansion school. But it's just to say that there's definitely a sense of tightening fraternal bonds between Spain and Ireland and Greece at the moment, as with every memorandum of understanding that we sign up to. So hopefully we can try and in this discussion, which will be just 3 short interventions by my colleagues here, and then a question session, in which you hopefully you will have some probing questions. Hopefully we can manage to draw up some kind of common agenda for economies which seem to now be in a very, very similar situation in which our sovereignty is being sucked away. And it's very difficult in Spain, and I get the same feeling in Ireland, to actually organise a protest movement against austerity when we don't actually know who is in charge here, really. And so I think that would probably be something we should try and develop some new ideas on. Anyway, I'll hand over to Tom McDonnell. We have here Rocío, who is who's just about to start the Catalan election campaign as Catalonia expresses its own response to this issue of sovereignty, which in Catalonia seems to be being channeled back into a kind of secessionist agenda. And Catalan nationalism, which I think is probably some kind of reflection of the sovereignty problem in Europe. So Rocío is here from the Catalan Socialist Party. I've got Zoe here from who's a Greek economist. From the Department of International Relations at the Greek Confederation of Trade Unions, and Tom McDonnell, who's the chief economist at TASC. So I'll hand over to you, Tom.
I suppose I'd first like to talk about the bizarre heading we saw, or the bizarre cover of Time magazine from last week, which seemed almost surreal. It was like we were in a kind of a parallel universe where suddenly Ireland had turned the corner. Of course, turning the corner, if it means going from unemployment of under 5% to almost 15%, with 142,000 net jobs lost in construction, 58,000 net jobs lost in industry, and 49,000 net jobs lost in retail, and with employment expected to fall again next year. If that's recovery, then I guess he's right. Of course, as well as the unemployment crisis in Ireland, we also have a severe indebtedness crisis. Public debt is very, very high. It's expected to reach, according to the Fiscal Council, 120% in terms of debt to GDP next year. If you use the alternative measure of debt to GNP, it's approximately 150%, which is around the area that Greece was before it got its debt right down, and well beyond the level that is considered sustainable by virtually any academic economist. Of course, at the same time, we also have a crisis of household debt. We have a crisis of commercial debt. And while that balance sheet recession, as we call it, persists, that's going to keep consumption and it's going to keep investment dampened down, which is going to have very negative consequences for employment and growth going ahead. Of course, there's also the banking crisis. Despite having the most expensive banking bailout as a proportion of a country's size since the Second World War, we still don't have banks that are lending. We've invested 41% of GDP, which is a terrifying number, frankly. And Yet, despite all this, gross fixed capital formation, or investment, if you prefer, is going to be the lowest in the European Union for the next few years. Of course, part of this is the government's policy to disproportionately slash the capital budget. And of course, the backdrop to all of this is that the poverty, inequality indicators are all getting worse, suicide rates are increasing, and so on and so forth. So all of this brings us to the fiscal crisis and the problem of the fiscal imbalances. And really, Plan A in Ireland to date has been to engage in what's known as internal devaluation. That is a process whereby a country is supposed to regain competitiveness by reducing wages, by cutting government spending, and so on and so forth, while also dealing with supposedly the fiscal imbalances. And to date, we've had 24.6 billion of discretionary fiscal adjustments, which means tax increases, or headline spending cuts. And unfortunately, Plan A also has a further 8.6 billion of increasing taxes and public spending cuts over the next 3 years. And in fact, the Fiscal Council has actually called for another slight adjustment, as they described it, which would be an additional 1.9 billion on top of that. So, or approximately €1,000 per person working in the state, a small adjustment. And what we've seen so far is that each year the Department of Finance, the ESRI, the IMF, and so on and so forth have been systematically wrong in terms of their predictions in terms of economic growth, employment, deficit reduction, debt sustainability, and so on and so forth. And the IMF at least have had the intellectual courage to look at the numbers again, and I applaud the IMF for doing so, and Olivier Blanchard, their chief economist. They've looked at, I think, a thing called multipliers. Multipliers show you the impact upon growth of a reduction in public spending, increase in taxes. Previously, the Department of Finance and other agencies were working under the assumption that for every €1 you take out of public spending and tax increases, the impact on the economy and growth would be 50 cents. The IMF are now saying that it's equivalent to between 90 and 170, i.e. their multipliers were out to the tune of 2 or 3 times. So this is the context for why growth perhaps hasn't materialized in the way the Department of Finance models have assumed, and it also has implications for what's likely to happen in terms of growth and employment going forward, all in the context of an economy which is expected to have a debt-to-GDP ratio, remember, and debt-to-GNP ratio of 150%, debt-to-GDP ratio of 120%. So I asked the question, are our debt dynamics in fact sustainable? Underlying all of this, of course, is the political issues as to austerity. A certain degree of it has to happen, of course it does, but how does that happen? It can happen on the taxation side, and there are various different ways you can do that. Consumption taxes, which are indirect taxes and disproportionately fall on the poor, or you can do it through direct taxation, which disproportionately falls on the richer in society. And then there's ways such as property tax, which hit wealth assets, and which TASC has come out in favour of. And all of this is in the context of comments by people like Ollie Wren, for example, who, when he came to Ireland in advance of the Irish bailout, looked with shock at the Irish numbers and immediately pointed to Ireland being a hyper-low tax regime. The implication was, well, you know what you have to do. Your level of public spending as a proportion of GDP is broadly middle of the road as a Western European country, but is off the wall when it comes to taxation. Part of this, of course, is the fact that tax receipts collapsed, but part of it is, in fact, that we aren't taxing ourselves enough to actually pay for Western European levels of public services, and that is ultimately a political decision. But it is one that all progressives should take on board, and take on board the fact that, in fact, if you want Western European levels of public services, you're going to have to pay for it. That is the choice, and the question is how you pay for it and who pays for it. What do you tax? What kind of economic activities do you tax? And the evidence is strongly that you tax areas such as passive income, such as rents, such as immovable property, and so on and so forth, as your first port of call. So the last budget, for example, was the most regressive, unfortunately, since the beginning of the crisis, according to ESRI estimates. There was a focus on consumption taxes, on VAT, despite governmental promises, there were in fact cuts to welfare, for example. Lone parents were very, very hard hit in the last budget. And again, to compare and contrast the potential choices available, pension tax reliefs are barely touched at all. And again, to refer to the ESRI, 80% of the benefits of pension tax reliefs go to the top 20% of earners. So again, these are political choices, and those choices are there. And in terms of economic growth and in terms of managing austerity, the evidence is that if you want to fiscally consolidate in a growth-friendly way, you do so by hitting the incomes of those that spend less in the economy, that have a lower marginal propensity to consume, that is higher earners, rather than people at the bottom who spend all of their income. And if you cut their income, you are cutting all of that income out of local economies, out of people's pockets, and you are destroying jobs. So that is a very, very important context for Ireland and for austerity and for how the process is handled over the next 3 years. Alongside that, of course, is the massive constraints that Ireland faces in terms of its borrowing costs and the implications, therefore, for debt sustainability, for managing our deficit, and so forth. And one of the issues that I'd like to open to the floor and for us all to consider is what policies at a Eurozone level can actually be adopted to deal with what is ultimately a systemic crisis, a crisis which is not just an Irish crisis or a Greek crisis or a Spanish or a Portuguese or an Italian or a Cypriot, and so on, and potentially, eventually French and Belgian. A crisis is that it isn't working as it is at the moment, but it can work. It is possible to do that. It is possible to institute a package of policy reforms at the Eurozone level that can deal with crises such as the Irish, Greek, and Spanish crisis. And I'd like to use this as an opportunity, including with the people in the audience, to have this debate and to begin this debate. We saw yesterday as well that perhaps the government strategy isn't being entirely successful with regard to the sustainability of our debt. Specifically, I am referring, of course, to the banking debt. And the question then is whether there needs to be a reappraisal of the Irish government strategy when it comes to dealing with the banking debt. Most of it, unfortunately, has already been paid. It now exists as preference shares, you'll be happy to know, in banks such as AIB. But some of it hasn't actually been paid yet. There's over 25 billion of it which has not actually been paid. Therefore, it's not true to say that all the cards are in one side's hands or the other. And again, I'd like to open up that to discussion, and I'm of course referring to specifically the promissory notes. But just 1 minute, very good. So I would refute very, very strongly the analysis by Time magazine that Ireland is in some way getting out of the crisis. We're seeing employment continuing to decline. People are continuing to migrate out of the country. My own generation has been devastated. Many of my own friends have been forced to leave the country because there are no jobs here. And that is a terrifying crisis. It is a failure of politics and it is a failure of economics, certainly within Ireland. But it's not just an Irish issue. And we do have to deal with this at the Eurozone level. And we can't ignore that fact. And our attention must go to that level. But also within Ireland, finally, and I realise I've only a few seconds left, I would make the point that, again, although it is politically incredibly unpopular to focus on taxation and specific types of taxation, we have to look at the budget, and TASC will be coming out with its equality budget in the next couple of weeks. Upon looking at the particular choices which minimise the damage to the weakest and most vulnerable in society, we have those choices available to us. Again, the Troika have never said that they are micromanaging. They have never said that they insist upon particular measures. What they're looking for is the overall aggregate package has to be a certain amount. And we must bear that in mind whenever we're told over the next 2 months that we have no choices. We do have sovereignty, we do have choices, and there are choices to make.